In this video, we're going to introduce materials. So we're going to start with the basics. We're going to see how materials are handled in Unreal Engine 5, and we will make some first examples using the basic channels or basic nodes that we find in a material. So we will create some reflection effect, and we will talk about specularity and glossiness, and also the emissive material, which acts like a light. So if I turn off the lights inside this scene, I'm gonna show you the effect of the emissive materials. So you can see here I only have a directional light and a skylight, but if I turn off this one here, I already see the effect of the emissive materials, which they can definitely light up a whole scene depending on how many objects I use as lights. So basically when I assign a material to an object, that's going to be transformed into some sort of light, and that's going to be part of the lighting system that you can create. So you can use this for interiors, you can use it for exteriors, and this is all, everything is real time. So if I change here the position, it's gonna change the way it's gonna light up the scene. And you can also see here our reflection work and the specularity of our object works. So it's really outstanding here how we can do everything in Unreal Engine 5 in real time thanks to Lumen and the new technologies in Unreal Engine 5. So before we actually get into materials, we already saw something with the landscape, so how we can create different layers and apply them to the painting mode and paint using different materials. So we saw the material editor, we can see it right away. So if I just open up any object, any material applied to any object, so this is from Quixel, I'm gonna open up the material. I can find it here in the details panel. If I double click on that material, it's gonna open up the editor, and this is where, well, this is not actually the editor itself or the dashboard where we can modify it, but we can already see the different layers, and this can be called also channels, or they can be called maps. So to get to the actual material definition, I can go here. So if I double click, this is the editor that we will use in Unreal Engine 5. Now this works with the right key. So I can move around with the right key, pan around, and I can use the scroll wheel of my mouse to zoom in and zoom out. And essentially, well, this is a customized material because we have like customized channels and final output, but it's similar when we create our material. So if I, and that's using textures as well. While in this first video, we're not going to talk about textures, but only going to talk about basic nodes and basic values. So this is the main node of the material. And a material is essentially a result of different layers stacked on top of each other. And every layer is going to give a different effect. So you have a base color, which is going to give the color to your material. And then you have these properties. And these are PBR material, which means physically based render materials, which means that they use what real materials in real life do. They act with physical reaction to the light. And these are all characteristics that we can tweak. So before we actually get into this editor and we start to create our own materials, let's do just a little bit of theory so we can see what we are talking about and what PBR material are. So I'm gonna turn off the light again, and we're gonna get back to this later. So I just want to jump into a browser and talk a little bit about PBR materials and materials in general. So we said that materials are the result, or shaders also, they are often called shaders. They are results of different effects that are applied, and most of the cases you will see textures. So when we use images, those images are called textures, and they can be applied to different channels of the material to represent a different effect. We're going to talk about textures in the next video. we're gonna focus on the effects in this video here, on the material characteristics. So everything it's about how the material reacts to the light, or the object reacts to the light. So this is what happens also in reality. When an object is hit by a light, it can respond in different ways. So it's all about how the surface responds and how the subsurface responds. So what's underneath the surface. So every material has just a little bit of reflection, but depending on how that material is gonna bounce the light back, so it's gonna change the way it's gonna reflect and the way it's gonna appear to your eye. So if it's gonna be hit by a light and you have this concentrated beam of light, you will get a specular effect, which means that you can see the light reflected on the surface, but if you have an exact reflection or an exact bounce, an exact concentrated ray, you will have reflections like a mirror object. So depending on how these rays are gonna hit the surface and how they're gonna bounce, you will get a different effect, which goes from perfect reflections to reflections of the lights to something more diffuse. So sometimes in software you see the diffuse channel, which means that it's gonna be like a generic color or a generic appearance, superficial appearance of the material. And then if we move on, you can see here that if you hit the light with a ray and then it's gonna be like scatter around, well, yes, that's gonna be diffuse, but it's also called roughness. So when a material is not reflective and it has a low specularity, a low glossiness, it will be rough. It will be a rough surface. So it's gonna be called roughness. So essentially, roughness, there we go. So you have some example here about the changing of the roughness. So the more the material is rough, the less neat and clean will be the reflections. And then you have glossiness, which is basically the opposite of roughness. So when an object is glossy, it has a low roughness. When a material is rough, it's gonna have a low glossiness. So they act one to the opposite of the other. They can be used together to manage the effect of the final material result. Now, in reality and also in PBR materials, we have two different categories which can be divided into these two groups of materials. So the first one is metallic, and in metallic, every material that's going to be a metal will fall into the metallic group. All the other ones, which means that they will be poor conductors and poor heat conductors and electrical conductor, they will be called dielectric. So which means that plastics and wood and all the other materials that are not metal will fall into the dielectric group. So we will talk about these effects essentially, and then we will move on into emissive materials. So what we see here, and you can see many examples just by searching on the web. Now, this is what's happening in reality, how the materials react. So let's get started with a really simple material, which is going to be a diffuse material. So I'm going to choose an object here in my world. These are the objects that we created in the video about the standard and simple objects in Unreal Engine. So I can take this one here, for example. To create a new material, I can go to Content Drawer and click on the Add, and you can pick a folder. In my case, I've created a folder called My Material. Okay, you can see these are the ones that you are seeing right now. So let's start with the first one, which is going to be a rough plastic, for example, or a rough material, which could be like paint or plastic or whatever. So I'm going to delete this, right click and delete. There you go. And I want to create a new one. To create a new one, I will go to Add and click on Material. And I'm going to call this Rough Material. Okay. So at first, it's going to look like this, like checkerboard. If we double click